show momentum, suspended twice from the Labour Party.
I'm afraid so.
Yeah, and so I'll just hand over the mic to Jackie. Thank you very much.
I'm sort of amazed that you've had the courage to come and hear me, because apparently both I and Tony are so dangerous that the police advised that any meeting might be a threat to public safety. That's the kind of madness we've got going on, isn't it? And just on that, if any of you want to go and have a look on the Wiesenthal website, you know, Wiesenthal was the guy who became the kind of the hunter of the SS after the war. You'll see that Jeremy Corbyn, Ken Livingstone and me are the biggest global threats to Jewry. I find that a phenomenon. Now, either that is some kind of hysteria, or it's lunacy, or there's some kind of politics behind this, because, to be honest, although my partner who's Jewish might complain about me now and again, I can't think of anything particularly bad that I've done to anybody who's Jewish. So there you go. We're living in extremely strange times. I recognise a few familiar faces here, but there are some people I know who I don't know at all. So I'm going to kind of start with a sort of context of who I am and what's happened to me over the last year. And one thing I would say is, you know, please tweet this out, Facebook it out. I'm really happy with that. I do know that my words are very frequently taken and chopped up and mangled and regurgitated on Twitter. Well, I'm not going to stop that. But I think, for me, it would be great if people see that every time they stop me or try to stop me from speaking, I manage to speak. There's now a growing, shall I say, tradition of trying to stop me to speak at PSC meetings. If you have a look and Google, you'll see that when I went to Norwich last time, there was actually what I would call a harassment campaign against the Methodist Church, which was where it was going to be held. So much so that the Methodists gave up, and in fact we were offered a home by the Quakers. Had a great meeting, actually, but it was then billed as a hate fest. Now, the extraordinary thing is Norwich PSC is a bit like a sort of English Tea Party meeting. It's so polite and so sweet, and the Quakers, and actually one of the speakers was a Jewish Quaker who was reaching out and actually was saying, there's no difference between us, we're all human. And she told this lovely story. Well, I thought it was lovely, until a Zionist pointed out that in fact it was deeply anti-Semitic, because what she quoted was a little story that she'd found about a German soldier in the war who had come across a group of Jews hiding in a cellar. So he went in and he saw this terrified group of families, and he very carefully shut the door and went back on patrol, knowing that if he had been found, he would have been shot. Have a look and see how that was tweeted out. It was tweeted out as PSC event says German Nazis were as bad as the Jews. That's how they tweeted it out. So tweet on, I say. Okay, well, until May of last year, I was really barely known. You know, I was a lifelong anti-racist, an activist, a trainer, a teacher, a writer, a lecturer. I was a kind of serial demonstrator on the streets against fascism and racism. As a young woman, I was active in the anti-apartheid movement, particularly in terms of the fight for the liberation of Namibia. And so I was in contact a lot with people in the anti-apartheid movement and very active in the boycott movement against apartheid South Africa. So for me, it was just a total logical progression. I didn't see it as something of a leap to go from that to become, if you like, a critic of Israeli policy towards Palestinians and a supporter of the boycott movement. And so I became a member of PSC, of Jews for Justice for Palestinians, and as well a member of freedom of speech, free speech on Israel, which is a mostly Jewish group. And I kind of want you to remember that, particularly those of you who are going to or have watched the Al Jazeera programme, because I think this issue is an even greater issue about what it means to be a fully democratic country. Because to tell you the truth, I'm terrified at this moment. I'm actually terrified, because let me tell you that I have tried, as have other colleagues and comrades in the last week, to get some kind of reporting going on in the mainstream media about what has happened with the Al Jazeera, with Ella Rose threatening to assault me. And the answer I got, the only paper we got an answer from was The Guardian, who actually said they were no longer commissioning any articles. That was just before they commissioned an article about cupcakes and momentum. What we actually have at the moment is an embargo on reporting this. And it's even running, because I got in contact with somebody I knew on the Morning Star editorial staff. It's even running with the Morning Star. And so I would encourage people to actually go on those sites, to actually ask, where are those people? Where's Owen Jones? Where's Aaron Bastani, who seem to get behind the anti-Semitism smear? Where are they now in response to what is happening? And we should not let them off. Now, my last year critics suggest my claims, because if you're black, you can only have a claim to Jewish identity, apparently, is something of a defence against being an anti-Semite. Well, clearly, actually, from what Tony has said about Israeli Jews who are anti-Semitic, this is not. But it's a way of putting what's happening to me in a context. Because, as Tony said, if you criticise Israel, it doesn't matter who you are. Chomsky is an anti-Semite, as we know. I'm an anti-Semite. Tony is an anti-Semite. Any Jew who criticises Israel is an anti-Semite. So do I hate Jews? Well, of course not. What I really do hate is the far right. I hate racism, and I hate the pernicious effect that Israel, led by this Netanyahu government, is having, not just on Middle Eastern, but on global politics and our own politics. So, let me just say something about how the witch hunt, and I do call it the witch hunt, against me started. And I'd like us to think as well there about why this level of hatred has been, in particular, vented towards me. So in February last year, there was a group called the Israel Advocacy Movement. Have a look on their website. They're quite an interesting group. Went fishing into my private Facebook account. Now, I'm not clear when or how I became identified as a threat to Israel, because that's their remit. Their remit is to identify people and organisations that are a threat to Israel. But if you look at the programme, the Israeli embassy official there basically admits that I'm being seen as a threat to Israel. I just find it extraordinary, that statement. But I presume what happened was that I was selected as a prominent supporter of Jeremy Corbyn to be, shall we say, let's use Ella Rose's terms now, taken down. Now, the posting I made was not a public posting. It was actually a private discussion with a Zionist Israeli friend of mine who knew something of my family history, because he had worked with me on kind of digging up that family history. And it was about the African Holocaust, and it was the fact that my ancestors were both Portuguese Jews and, well, they're also Ashkenazi Jews, but they were, in particular, they were Portuguese Jews, and they were also Africans who had been involved, both sides of them, in the sugar and slave trade. Now, this Facebook post, which I think if you stretch an imagination, what happened is that I missed out one word, which was amongst, became transformed by the Jewish Chronicle into Momentum activist says the Jews caused the African Holocaust. Now, honestly, I would have to be really stupid, to even propose such nonsense like that. But anyway, what happened, and this is why I'm linking it to the media, is The Guardian, The Times, The Telegraph, the BBC, Channel 4, every single media outlet reproduced that headline. Not one of them came to me to ask questions. So I think in a way what you have is a mixture of laziness and an unwillingness to question what is going on here because of the political aims behind this. So I was investigated in detail by the Labour Party. My Facebook posts were all trawled up. Everything I said was trawled up. I had my interview, and I was, I don't know what you call it, but desuspended after 4 weeks. But as the Israeli official told us, that wasn't enough. People like the right wing of the Labour Party, so our friend Tristan Hunt, for example, insisted on still calling me an anti-Semite. Extraordinary, isn't it, that these people don't recognise the workings of their own party, but there you go, it's not a surprise that he's now left to join the VNA. So what I'm troubled about is that this media, even, or not even, but in particular, papers like The Guardian, who are thought to be liberal, reproduce this stuff. By the way, I can't tell you who, but Al Jazeera apparently had a conversation with an editor of a major national newspaper about why they weren't publishing this stuff, particularly about me. And they said, look, all year we have run stories basically suggesting or saying that she's an anti-Semite. We've all actually taken what you've found seriously. We think it's very troubling and it's made us ask questions. But the last thing we're going to do is to publish an article that's going to undermine what we've been saying for a year. Now that's very worrying, isn't it? So this has now grown into a sort of victimisation, I think, of organisations like the Palestine solidarity groups, because every time I speak anywhere, Facebook posts get hacked and people get harassed. I can see somebody in this room, for example, who, because they were photographed with me at one point, were also politically harassed and had to take those posts down extremely quickly. So we have this situation where people like me, people like Jeremy, who've opposed war, racism all their life, are now being called anti-Semites. Now, as Tony said, these attempts to smear Jeremy started really before he became the actual leader. It started when he became the candidate. And what's interesting, isn't it, is it's the very same newspapers who posted what I think of as anti-Semitic articles about Ed Miliband, who then started to jump up and down about anti-Semitism. What I find extraordinary is the lack of ability of some people to put two and two together and make four. Now, these accusations not only weaponised anti-Semitism, in my mind, they became a sort of weapon of political mass destruction. And like all nuclear options, they entailed collateral damage, not just to Labour or the Labour movement, but to all pro-Palestinian anti-war groups, to individuals, to their families, to their friends, and to the political communities they are part of. And what I'd like to suggest is, can we please go back to the times when being a racist is not about missing off a word in a Facebook post, where it's not about getting a date wrong or calling some dubious politician a friend in an attempt at finding agreement. Because suddenly we find ourselves at a time where racists are not people who demand migrants are deported, who want to exclude migrants. Racists are not even people who complain of a TV reporter wearing a headscarf. No, it's the left, we are told, who are the culprits in this new racism, or shall we say, this new anti-Semitism. Now, we know the Israeli government has allocated millions to fund undisclosed activities to undermine the BDS, the boycott campaign. And we know the fight is being led against BDS by Israel's Minister of Strategic Affairs, and that they have hired workers whose names are classified, that they have an intelligence section run by former security services operatives that received assistance from a special unit within Israeli military intelligence, as well as the secret police, and that individuals as well as groups are targeted. And as Tony said, we've seen the result of this in France. And what I'm really worried about here is that we're well on the way to that happening here. When you can have, as happened in November last year, Tom Watson, the deputy leader of the Labour Party, at a Labour Friends of Israel dinner, calling out supporters of the boycott movement as immoral. That's what we're on the way to. So, of course, I oppose all forms of racism, but I will not be silenced on criticism of the Israeli government. I agree Zionism should not be used as abuse or cover for attacking Jewish people. However, Zionism is part of the political lexicon and essential to challenging the concept of a Jewish state. And in that little sentence tells you something about the initial disagreement between me and the chair of Momentum, John Lansman, which I believe led to my demotion. That, and what he has been quoted as saying, his warm relations with Jeremy Newmark, who leads the Jewish labour movement. If you want to find out about the kind of person Jeremy Newmark is, I suggest you have a look and see what a judge said about him when he was caught out lying in a court. Opposition to the Jewish state remains a legitimate, honourable political position, and one that many, including many Jews, have stuck to for decades, and I will not be silenced on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Jackie with your insight, and I really enjoyed listening to that. We're now going to start a discussion or question and answer, so if you want to ask the panel any questions, or if you just want to give a general comment, raise your hand and speak away. Anyone?
Not difficult to say this once before. For about 55 years, I've watched and despair about the Palestine and Israeli situation. I think this mutual rationalisation seems to me, in this race, is just no comment, that you forget that the emotional response that is sort of inculcated and becomes almost a Pavlovian response, even the word Jewish is mentioned. In my experience during that time, there's a natural reticence for the vast majority of people that you meet and try and discuss So a rational approach doesn't seem to work. There's a certain inculcation, Pavlovian response from ordinary people, for want of a better word. And what you haven't got in this organisation, or indeed in these meetings, or this sort of, this view that you want to promote quite rightly, is a powerful, and I hesitate to use the word, but it is a propaganda system, which the Israelis certainly have got, to meet that challenge. And rationalisation may not take you very far, and so it's a dismal comment, but I had an MP when I was very, very young in South London, Margaret McKay, who was driven out of her seat because she was pro-Arab. You've got, on television we did have Robin Cook when he was in Rome getting very angry about what he'd seen, and it's all for nothing, and it's very, very sad. And Jenny Teague now has been, verbally and slandered, libelled, for, not people weren't interested in the facts she was mentioning, it's just this response, this emotional one. And I think that's something that's very hard to meet, but just an observation for what it's worth.
Yeah, sure, of course it is, but it hasn't happened by accident, has it? Can I just ask people, if they're interested in that, to read The Holocaust Industry by Norman Finkelstein. If you want to understand how, if you like, we've been trained to some extent to respond in that Pavlovian way, I think that book is extremely informative. And I quite take the criticism. We haven't got, we're not backed by millions. You're absolutely right. We haven't got the backing of the state. We don't have millions to actually defend our positions. All we can do is do as much as we can do and refuse to be silenced and refuse to be browbeaten by this label that they try to put on us. And it's not even just a label. That threat of a physical assault that was made against me, that's in that Al Jazeera documentary, that's not a joke. It's not a joke. It's a reality. And the fact that when people like me gain this level of visibility, that what also happens is that I have my daughter and my friends saying, please can you stop it, we're scared for you, is part of the whole level of harassment that happens. We don't have that level of money and resources. We don't even get access to the media. I mean, it's an outrage. It's a total, utter outrage that the Guardian newspaper, let's forget the Telegraph, you expect it from the right, but the Guardian newspaper can run vitriolic articles against me for a whole year, and after this documentary, which has insight in what happened about me, when I ask for an article to be published, refuse it. It is extraordinary and concerning. So, yeah, I think we have problems.
Can I just say my comments will certainly not to forget all the good work you've done in standing up. Sorry,
No, I didn't take it as that.
I think the explanation in the sense lies with something Karl Marx said many years ago, which is the ruling ideas in any society are the ideas of the ruling class. And that's what would happen, because what happened as a result, even before Jeremy was elected as the leader, despite the fact he's been totally abysmal, I have to say, was a congruence between two different groups. There was the Zionists on the one hand, but there's also the Labour right, the Progress, etc. on the other hand. So you actually had the absurdity of a left Zionist standing for the national executive of the Labour Party, but because she was on the left, Rhea Wolfson, she was actually accused in essence of anti-Semitism by the right of the Labour Party, even though she was a member of the Jewish Labour movement. It becomes even more absurd. But that is what we have. It's quite understandable. I mean, British imperialism, when we went to India, which we exploited to the nth degree, we didn't justify it by saying that we were going to exploit them for all we could because our economy needed it and we wanted a higher living standard. We said we were going to actually stamp out a Hindu custom called sati, which some of you may know of, whereby the wives of men who died were burnt on their husband's funeral pyre, things like that. So British colonialism, in fact colonialism worldwide, has always done what it's done. And you've rationalised it as being benevolent. Same in Iraq. We went into Iraq to give the Iraqis democracy. The fact we killed 1 million of them in the process was just by the by. So what's happening with Israel, etc., is the same. When they say they're fighting anti-Semitism, they've transformed the Holocaust and what happened to the Jews as a kind of ideological weapon to be used today against the left, against anyone else who rises up. They couldn't do that with South Africa because it was literally too black and white. But in the case of Israel, of course, they're able to justify it by reference to what happened in the Holocaust, even though most of the Jews who died were not Zionists at all. Until 1945, most Jews in the world were anti-Zionist. I mean, I'll give you an example. The Jewish community that suffered the most in the Holocaust was in Poland. Of the 3.3 million Jews who were in Poland, 3 million died in the gas chambers, primarily of Auschwitz and Treblinka. In 1938, in the last 3 elections in Poland, the local authority elections, they used to have a system whereby it was under the League of Nations. You had the minorities treaty, so the Jews actually voted for seats of their own. And in Warsaw, of the 20 Jewish council seats, 17 were won by the Bund, which was a Jewish socialist anti-Zionist party. The Zionists won 1. Overall, in Warsaw, 61% were won by the Bund of the Jewish vote. The Zionists won, I think, less than 20%. And it was replicated throughout Poland. That in every major city, the Bund won a majority of seats, and they were in alliance with the Polish Socialist Party. Of course, most of the results were either annulled, like in the Labour Party these days when the left win, or they were cancelled, yes, or in momentum for that matter. But I think people need to understand that opposition to Zionism historically was always greatest amongst Jewish people themselves until the end of the Second World War. So all this talk about anti-Zionism being anti-Semitism is quite the contrary. Most people used to see Zionism as a form of Jewish anti-Semitism, and that really is today still the same. Sorry. Yes.
It's okay. What I wanted to say, first of all, was I'm one of these people who was an entryist in the Labour Party. Not when Jeremy was elected, or even when Jeremy was standing, but actually trying to get into the party immediately after the election, which the Labour Party lost. I won't go into the story, it's irrelevant, it's funny, I'll tell people some other time over a pint, as to how I was accepted, not accepted, and then let in after I couldn't vote. But the question I'm really concerned about is there now any point whatsoever as a committed, above all else, a committed campaigner for Palestine and for the freedom of the Palestinian people to play any attempted role in the machinations of an utterly corrupt political party?
I just want to mention a personal story, which I don't often do. It's just that my father, Hitler made my father Jewish. My father never actually called himself Jewish. He was born in Czechoslovakia. He escaped from Czechoslovakia at the age of 18. He always called himself Czech. I remember as a child. He never said, I'm Jewish or anything like that. They say you've got a funny accent. Where do you come from? And he says, Czechoslovakia. I'm Czech. Anyway, when I was a teenager, I was invited to go to this Zionist youth club, which was nearby, by a friend of my father's. And I thought, well, why not? Because I didn't know much about it. And I told my father, and he was really upset. I mean, very upset. So you don't need to, why
Jewish country at all. Oh, by the way, my father's whole family was wiped out at Auschwitz, so, you know, that's just one of the ironies, isn't it? He was completely anti-Zionist, vehemently anti-Zionist, and I mean, really upset, really upset. And so that tunes into what you said, Tony, about, you know, most Jews were sort of, they were sort of on the left and anti-Zionist. You know, if you read stories about the Warsaw Ghetto, there was a battle, political battle going on between the Zionists and the people who were anti-Zionist. And the majority were anti-Zionist. Zionists were the main fighters at all. Yeah. So it's a sort of a fabricated history, that's what I'm saying. After the war, it suddenly becomes an automatic expression of an outcome of the Holocaust. But it wasn't at all. The Israelis used the Holocaust as a way of backing it up and guilt-tripping people into supporting them. So, you know, one's got to be careful with this thing about anti-Semitism and what's anti-Semitism. We can, in fact, talk too much about that. I'm much more interested in Palestinian rights, and I think that's the road we ought to go down. You know, if people go up to me and say, you know, what do you think about all this anti-Semitism in the Labour Party? And I'll just say, well, I don't think there is any. But what about the Palestinians? And let's talk about the Palestinians and the gross injustices that they've been facing. And what can we do about it? Let's start from that.
Take another one before we go back to the panel. Angie?
Yes, Tony mentioned that he was going to bring up at the PSC conference coming up that they should be doing more to counter what's being said. And Jackie's mentioned we should be tweeting over social media and so on, which we can all do. But I just wonder if there's something on a rather more grander scale in terms of organised activities, what we should be doing, for instance, to counter the compliance unit in the Labour Party, to challenge what they're doing to get that changed, because theoretically they should be suspending people left, right and centre who have arisen out of the Al Jazeera programmes, for instance. And in terms of momentum, I know there's several momentum people in this room. What should we be doing in an organised way to actually try and challenge what they have done as well?
God, I think it's going to take me about an hour to answer all those questions. I'm not going to do them in any order, I'm just going to do them as they come. I have to say that one of the problems for activists like me is that our support is not as visible out there. You know, there's nobody outside Labour Party headquarters, there's no group of people picketing out there saying, this has got to stop. And I think that is a real problem. You know, we need the support of a movement behind us and with us and supporting us to get access at all. Can I just say, and it's hard because maybe people haven't seen what's happened, but the president of the Jewish Labour Movement, which is actually affiliated, it's an affiliate for historical reasons to the Labour Party, it's a Zionist grouping basically, has actually made personal threats against me. Now what I want you to remember is the context in which suspensions were going on, where if you put on your page traitor, you would be suspended. Now what I'm asking for is, why hasn't Ella Rose yet been suspended? And if you want to know what you should be doing, you do not have to be a member of the Labour Party, I've been told, to complain of hearing threats of physical assault being made by a member of the Labour Party. What's even worse about Ella Rose is that she was tweeting out recently how proud she is that she's on this Joe Cox Memorial Leadership Programme. So there she is, making threats of physical attacks on another woman, and she has the nerve to align herself with somebody who was actually killed because of her political visibility. I'm now going to speak in terms of momentum, and quite often I wasn't really able to speak freely because I was the vice chair. I mean, what's happened in momentum now, whichever side you're on, whether, you know, whichever side you're on, is a travesty of democracy. You know, whether, however you want it, there is nothing that is fair about what's happened there. But what really concerns me in this, and I will tell you this story, and I know I'm going on record by saying this. We were at a steering committee meeting, and a number of us wanted to have access to the leadership. We said, we want to be able, we're not just Jeremy's cheerleaders, we want to be able to meet the leadership and discuss with them what their programmes are, what their policies are. John Lansman said, well, you've got no need to do that. I meet with the leadership all the time. Now, of course, I knew that, but in any case, you know. So I said, great, what do you talk to the leadership about? And he said, anti-Semitism. And I said to him, do you ask or talk about any other form of racism? And of course he realised the trap that he had fallen into, and there was silence, stuttering, and then he said, no. I know, because I have spoken to John in detail, that he feels it's his mission to make relations between Momentum, the Labour Party, and Zionist organisations, in particular, like I said, Jeremy Newmark. Now, nobody in Momentum has even been allowed to vote on it, let alone talk about this. Who decided Rhea Wolfson would be Momentum's representative on the slate as a member of the JLM? Nobody I know except John Lansman. I'm not going to answer all the questions because I know I've taken up a lot of the time. I just want to say two things. It's extraordinary now that we can't talk about history anymore, isn't it? That we're so scared of talking about our history, whether it is the history of the African diaspora or the history of the establishment of Israel. We are terrified in hearing it. And in terms of Jewish ancestry, I have to tell you that what's happened to me recently, and again you can see this if you have a look on Twitter, some Zionists somewhere have actually paid money to try and construct my family tree to prove I'm not a Jew. Now the hilarious thing about this is anybody who knows anything about Jamaican culture would know that they are wasting their time doing that. This is not how Jamaican culture works in any case. And also, there is a resonance here, isn't there? When they start talking about, is it on your mother's side or your father's side? And what proportion of Jew are you? There's a real resonance here of what the Nazis did. Because any agenda that is based on race and racial purity is going to run into trouble, isn't it, when it tries to define and to regulate itself by how much of a Jew are you. And that's the kind of dangerous bedfellows we're seeing. The same dangerous bedfellows, I think, as we're seeing in this, in what we're seeing with Trump and the alt-right and the racist nationalists there and the far-right Zionists.
Okay, yeah, thanks. If I can pick up on that last point, I mean, it is actually quite important to decide who is a Jew and who is not a Jew, especially in terms of Israel. Because what does a Jewish state mean? It doesn't simply mean that, I mean, let me give you an example. You see, Britain is nominally a Christian state. The Queen is the head of the Church of England. But we don't have in Britain the Christian National Fund, which says, if I want to buy somewhere, sorry Tony, this is national, Christian national land, you can't do it, you can't rent there, you can't go there. But in Israel, there is a Jewish National Fund which owns and controls 93% of the land. And even, you know, when Arabs want to rent from private Jewish landlords, you have, like in Safed, one of the major Jewish cities, it's primarily Jewish, because most cities are. The chief rabbi, Shmuel Eliyahu, who's the son of, or was the son of the Sephardic chief rabbi, issues an edict saying it is a sin for Jews to rent to Arabs. You Google that, Shmuel Eliyahu, Google Safed and chief rabbi, and it'll come up. And there was a great controversy about this. Of course, when it died down, it still continued. He was backed by dozens of other rabbis in Israel, and he is a state official, so his salary is paid by Israel. And that is the type of racism. So in Israel, being Jewish means you're privileged. You have privileges over and above non-Jews. And that is why it's important to make sure that Jackie is Jewish. Because she can't automatically assume that she's entitled, if she were to go there, that she would have those rights. I'm okay, both my parents were, so there's no problem with that, they never question it. But in your case, I mean, it's problematic. And certainly, I mean, in terms of black people, they had the black Hebrews who were deported from Israel back to the United States because, to be quite honest, being black is not really... It's not really kosher, I suppose. I mean, nothing personal, Jackie, but you know, when you're in a society where being Jewish gives you certain rights and privileges, you can't be too careful. Now, Zionists come back and say, oh, well, there's 99 Islamic states in the world, there's just one Jewish state. There is a difference. Being Islamic in Iran or in Saudi Arabia is not a bonus, it's just a means by which the state rationalises the way they oppress people who are Islamic. It doesn't entitle you to anything, whereas in a Jewish state, just like in the white state of South Africa, being of the ruling elite gave you privileges, and that's why it's important to define who is and who is not Jewish. And that's what happened in Israel. And if I can go back, I mean, Ken Livingstone was, say, suspended for just really touching on these things. I dug up today, as I was coming out, a page from Lucy Davidovich. She's a Zionist historian, a right-wing Zionist. She's no longer alive, but she wrote a rather good book, which you might want to get, called The War Against the Jews, which is a summary of what happened during 1939-1945, and she quotes from Schwarzkopf, which was the official newspaper of the SS, and it argued, and I'm quoting, the Zionists adhere to a strict racial position, and by emigrating to Palestine they're helping to build their own Jewish state. And it goes on to say that Heydrich issued a directive to the Bavarian political police, that is the Gestapo, that the activity of the Zionist-oriented youth organisations are to be treated differently to those of what they called the assimilationist Jewish organisations. So there's no doubt in Nazi Germany, if you were a Zionist, they made a differentiation. Of course, it did not mean that the Zionists held power, and it did not mean in come 1941, when the final solution occurred, that Zionists also were not amongst those who were eliminated. But there's no doubt that the Zionist movement, especially abroad, the Jewish agency in Palestine, took a very deliberate decision that the building up of Palestine was a much more immediate priority than the saving and the rescue of Jews. I mean, I don't have time to go into that, but there's a good book by Lenny Brenner, and I've written in the Journal of Holy Land Studies articles on this, but this is a forbidden topic, of course, in the Labour Party. The other thing I think people mentioned was about momentum. And again, let's put it in priority, in perspective, and also the programmes that we saw on Al Jazeera in perspective. If you think about it, that when it became likely, I mean, I've known Jeremy Corbyn for over 30 years, and there's nobody less likely to become the national leader of the Labour Party than he. I don't think he ever thought in his wildest dreams that he'd become elected. It was a combination of circumstances, not least the defeat of Labour in the last general election, which led to it. But I imagine that when it became clear that Jeremy was going to be elected as leader, not only the Israeli embassy panicked because of Corbyn's record on Palestine, but also in the American embassy. The idea of our second major ally, the second major party, being led by someone who was anti-NATO and anti-nuclear weapons, stirred some people to engage in what you might call as dirty tricks. I mean, the CIA's, the whole purpose of that organisation is to destabilise countries whose politics they don't agree with. And I imagine that what we're seeing today in the Labour Party, what we have seen for the last year, doesn't simply emanate from Mark Regev and the Israeli embassy, but also the American embassy as well. But Al Jazeera hasn't been able to do a documentary on that. So what we are living through is an attempt at political destabilisation. And that's what those of us who are in Momentum, etc., have to be aware of. And that's why I think what's happening in Momentum today with John Lansman, if anyone of you have read my blog, is so important. It is a political fight to retain control, if you like, of the major organisation of the left. And Palestine's come to symbolise that for its own reasons.
This man's sitting by the whiteboard, and then Richard.
Well, you're both absolutely right to say that the issue of anti-Semitism has been used as a weapon by the right wing to undermine the changes that Jeremy Corbyn's election as leader of the Labour Party represented. And also, other speakers have also mentioned the opposition of the majority of certainly European Jewry to the foundation of a Jewish state in Israel up to the time of the Second World War. The question I think now is 70 years later, how can the rights of the Palestinians be put forward? How can they win their justified rights 70 years after this state was formed? A very powerful state backed by all the might of US imperialism. And I think it's essential in order to defeat Israeli capitalism, the Israeli state, to break away from the majority of Israeli working class people. I don't agree quite with your wording, Tony, where you said that there are material privileges for all Jewish people in Israel. Maybe there are some marginal privileges, the right to buy land if you have land, if you have the money to buy land. But if you're a bus driver or a docker or a nurse or any other type of worker, in the end, you are being exploited, just as workers are anywhere else in the world by the employing class. And so how can this working class, someone who have now been there 3 or more generations, be broken away from the idea that Netanyahu and all those other right-wing politicians are somehow acting in their interests, when of course that government is most clearly not. And that's where I think the issue of how anti-Semitism and how the struggle for Palestinian rights here becomes a material factor in the situation, because there's no doubt that just as the Israeli embassy used their agents to try and influence public opinion here, they also relay back into Israel and distort this issue in order to try and show to working class people in Israel, look, you're under attack, you need government, Netanyahu and the rest of them to defend them. And that's why it's essential, I think, that as well as recognising the national rights of Palestinians, the right to return, the right
battled against the occupation, and so on. There also has to be a recognition of the rights of Israeli workers. And that is absolutely impossible on the basis of either a single capitalist state or two capitalist states. It can only be achieved on the basis of socialism, a socialist, initially, a socialist Israel and a socialist Palestine, which will then make the basis for negotiations between democratically elected and democratically controlled workers' representatives to work out how can the right to return be sorted out, how can the common capital of Jerusalem be worked out, and all the rest of it. Only on the basis of socialism can that be achieved, and I think we, as socialists, need to raise and link this issue to this whole question.
Okay, before I take another question, can please someone tell me the time?
10 to 3.
10 to 3, okay, we've still got quite a lot of time. I'm going to go to Richard, then Farouk.
Right, I was actually going to start from where Ivan left off, talking about coming into the movement, crime concerns, and Palestinian rights, but I think that has a lot of implications, because I'm very interested in the argument in the Labour Party, but we can get so focused internally, we can find we're not speaking to those masses of people who have now become electrified by the possibility of change and having an anti-austerity party and involving them all in what's now going on. But I think that's been a big sadness, all this, the whole focus on anti-Semitism inside the Labour Party, the internal arguments in the Labour Party in momentum at the moment. There's a whole swathe of people who aren't getting involved in activity at the moment. And that's such a crying shame. And actually, that's the way I think to turn around these internal arguments, is to have a kind of mass movement on issues like Palestine or the health service, things like that, outside the Labour Party. And I think that's something I'd really like to see being addressed. I think there are things to say about the one or two state solution in Palestine and take up some of John's arguments. But I think the key thing at the moment is how can we involve all these new people that come into politics in the last 18 months? Because with Trump, the other bad things in the world, that must be our future. And I think we need to start addressing how can we get these people involved in some activity that's exciting, because what's going on in momentum, as I see it, is a very small clique of people at the moment. It doesn't involve us.
Farouk?
Yeah, I had a really quick question, a really quick reply to the gentleman back. The reason that would work is the West have tried in the past to impose socialism onto Arabs, and because that's doing now, so it wouldn't work. Socialism wouldn't work in that part. A lot of people have got faith in that the conflict there. The question I had was how do we reclaim the Arabs as being Semites?
Well, to deal with the last question first, I mean, people should not become too hung up with language, because language changes its meaning, definitions, usage over time. The reason why anti-Jewish racism was defined as anti-Semitism goes back to the fact that Wilhelm Marr, who was a German anti-Semite around, I think it was 1879, decided that he would define Jews on the basis of the language they spoke, which was the Semitic language, and therefore he divided them into a kind of racial category, because this was the period when, if you like, religious anti-Semitism was becoming transformed into racial anti-Semitism, in the same way that racism itself was being scientifically defined, or so-called scientifically defined. Well, there was a reason for that. It was because of colonialism. In the colonial era, you had to justify the fact that you went and occupied other people's lands, and you did it on the basis that they weren't as advanced and as civilized as you. And it had a so-called, a pseudo-scientific basis. And that's how the term anti-Semitism came. But Semitic relates to a language. It doesn't relate to a race, because there is no such thing as a Semitic race. So I think people shouldn't get hung up about definitions. Language does change its usage over time, and that's what's become accepted as a way of describing Jewish racism. In the same way as Islamophobia is really a form of anti-Muslim racism. It doesn't really have anything to do with hatred or dislike of the Islamic religion, although it may manifest itself as that. It's to do with pure and simple racism, which is related to the conquest of what are termed Islamic countries. As regards some of the other questions, why? Let's put it like this. Alexander Haig, if you remember, for those of you with good memories, was the Secretary of State under Ronald Reagan. And he was asked why America gives Israel the support it did. And he said it was quite simple, that Israel was an unsinkable aircraft carrier in a very unstable region, and that giving it $3 billion a year was quite cheap at the price. And I think he was right. I mean, that's the explanation for American support for Israel. It's got nothing to do with a Jewish vote or a Jewish lobby or anything else. It's to do with naked, raw political interests. And if there was a divergence with those interests, then America wouldn't support Israel. But it's a settler colonial state, and that really revolves around the subject that, sorry, I don't know your name over there. Said. You're right. The privileges that Israeli Jewish workers have may be quite marginal, but nonetheless they exist. And that's the important thing. I mean, they're even more marginal in Northern Ireland, but Protestant workers nonetheless felt they had those privileges, and they acted and reacted politically accordingly. Even in South Africa, the privileges that white working class miners, for example, had were also relatively marginal, but precisely because they were marginal, they fought to defend them. And the same is true in Israel. You're part of the ruling body of society, or you feel you are. You feel you're more privileged. The same happened in the southern states of America with white workers as well, in terms of segregation in the deep south. So this is a common phenomenon. And Israel is a settler colonial state. It's where people came and they settled and they colonized it, and they did it as a part of a Western form of society. And they felt that they had those privileges, and they were in many ways right. They may be marginal, but they were very real to them. And that's why you have in Israel the most reactionary right-wing section of the Israeli Jewish population. It's not, if you like, the middle and upper classes. It's actually the workers. It's the workers who voted for Likud, who vote for Naftali Bennett's Jewish Home and Lieberman's party, Israel Beteina. It's actually the working class and settler colonial states is actually the most right-wing and most racist section of that society. The same was true in South Africa. The bastion of the Afrikaners, the Nationalist Party, was actually the working class in many ways. The richest suburbs voted for the more progressive party and previously the Liberal Party. Helen Suzman's constituency in Cape Town was actually the richest one of all, not the poorest. So that's how politically these things pan out. That if racism exists in the society, in a settler colonial society, then often it's the working class who identify most with it. So the question is how it can be overcome. I actually don't think the situation in Palestine can be overcome within the existing borders. There are reasons for that. In South Africa, you had a situation where the white regime, if you like, was actually, became weaker and weaker because of the surrounding overthrow of Portuguese colonialism in Mozambique and Angola. If you like, the strategic position of white domination in southern Africa became progressively weaker and weaker and marginalised. In Israel, the Jewish population is approximately equal to the Palestinian population within Palestine. But you also have the problem of the Arab regimes and the Arab states surrounding it, which are also the junior allies of imperialism. So the long-term solution, I think, is quite clearly, is the overthrow of those Arab regimes. You have a situation in the West Bank with Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority, which operates as a subcontracting regime to the Israeli state. I mean, Abbas was quite clear. He said cooperation with the Israeli military was sacred, inverted commas, and to him it is sacred. It does the work of the Israeli army, the Israeli intelligence. It's very cheap at the price, and that is part of the problem. It's not simply a national struggle, but it's also a social struggle as well, and that pertains throughout the whole of the Middle East, if you like. The struggle of the Arab masses to overthrow their own rulers is part and parcel of the overthrow of Zionism. But where we disagree is settler colonial states are a particular form of capitalist state, which we don't see in the West for obvious reasons. But in Africa we did, in Algeria we did, and Israel today is really the only active settler colonial state that's left.
Well, I think Tony said it all, really, and you know, that for me is very resonant, what you said about both South Africa and the southern states of America. Of course, there were lots of similarities between the working classes, the white working classes and the black working classes. But for goodness sake, you know, if you were living in the southern states of America, I know that what I would prefer to be would be white working class and black working class for sure. And those differences make a real difference, because it wasn't the whites who were being lynched. There's quite an important difference there. Just like it's not the Jewish Israeli population that is being killed, that's being deprived of water, that is being deprived of medical care and seeing their children and their babies die. In the same way to what we see. So I think to put that kind of equal balance is a very limited view. But I think, you know, Tony's spoken to that very well. In terms of how to involve people in politics, it's always a problem, isn't it? I have to say, I think we have to be really realistic in this. I think mostly we do it at the margins, even when we do it really effectively. And I'll give you an example of that from this last election of Momentum. And I think these issues do touch on Palestine, because I do think in Momentum you have a body of people who are also the same kind of activists who get involved in these kind of organisations. Mostly, you never get more than about 15% response in most of the surveys done by Momentum. In the same way, you have 22,000 members, but active members, i.e. not just click members as they're called, but members who will go out on the street, who will campaign actively and organise things, somewhere between 2,000 to 3,000 people. What we don't do, how we don't get people energised, is by having a top-down structure. And it really does, and I think that runs through too to in terms of what's happening in PSC. It does concern me. It does concern me that apart from activities in groups like this, that somehow PSC is not visibly out there. I mean, I'm not, even and I would look out for it, I'm not aware of PSC sending letters, organising demos outside of the Labour Party for what's going on. And actually, in terms of going back to this thing about the rights of Palestinians and not getting too unbalanced in terms of thinking about anti-Semitism, at the moment, these two things are co-joined. They really are. Because unless we can defeat what is this sort of witch hunt about anti-Semitism, we can't speak about Palestine. And if we stop being, 80% of Tory MPs are members of the Friends of Israel. The Labour Party is what we've got. If in the Labour Party we're silenced, that means in terms of the government of this country, we will be silenced in terms of Palestinian rights. It is crucially important that we win this.
Mr. Mark, and then you.
Yeah, it was great to see that back in August, I'm a Celtic supporter. It was great that Celtic supporters protested outside the stadium where they were playing the Israeli team in the Champions League. in Glasgow, the local PCS, Palestine Solidarity Group, was giving out Palestinian flags to supporters, and it was great to see the big, massive Palestinian flags being displayed in the stadium, and I am absolutely proud of that, of those supporters who stood up, who really stood up to defy the media and all the other stuff that was going off. It was great to see that football, that it is now, and now in Palestine they are shouting our beloved Celtic FC, and it's great that the camaraderie and the support, and I would like to start a campaign to one with the sponsors of Celtic, which is Coca-Cola. I looked on their website and it's got Coca-Cola for their sponsors, and I would like to start a campaign to put pressure on Celtic management to suspend their promotion with Coca-Cola and really press them on that they should be selling Coca-Cola products while the Celtic supporters are supporting the Palestinian fight, because it's like the Irish, they always are rebels, and they always support the underdog, and it's important that we carry on supporting the Palestinians in their fight, in their thing, to try and really press it home. And hopefully, yesterday I was on Speaker's Corner speaking about why is it our government is doing deals with the Israelis by supplying them weaponry that's killing Palestinians, while our government should be on trial for war crimes against the Palestinian people, they should. And it's absolutely a thing. And also with this DSI, which I've watched a lot of it on internet, on YouTube, and it was great that people got into that and seen exactly what the UK is contributing to other regimes and supplying weaponry to Israel.
Yes, one piece of, it's a piece of embarrassing history, and it's been used as anti-Palestinian propaganda. The religious authorities of the old city of Jerusalem, prior to World War II, were Nazi collaborators, and Germany had promised that if we got rid of the British, help us get rid of the British, we would help you establish the Palestinian state at that time. It's been, I have come across this, it's been used by sort of pro-Zionists and other leftists to sort of discriminate what would happen against a future Palestinian state, that we can't to be ever trusted again. And can't answer that.
Are you referring to the Mufti?
Was it the Grand Mufti?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is everyone aware of who the Mufti of Jerusalem is and so on? He was the head of the Islamic, I suppose, not church, but whatever the equivalent is, in Palestine during the Mandate period, which is from 1920 to 1948. Hajj Amin al-Husseini. And he was also a collaborator during the war with the Nazis, and there is no doubt he was at all. Netanyahu, do any of you remember the speech that Netanyahu gave to the World Zionist Organization, the Congress? It was in 2015. This guy, maybe I'll just give you the background really. In 1920, the head of the Islamic faith, if you like, in Palestine was called the Grand Mufti, and he controlled considerable amount of revenue. And there was an election. It was under the first VICAP, the first British High Commissioner in Palestine was a guy by the name of Sir Herbert Samuel. Any of you remember him or have heard of him? Viscount Samuel he became. He was instrumental in obtaining, or was a very strong proponent of obtaining the Balfour Declaration in 1917. And of course, this year is the centenary of the Balfour Declaration, when Britain handed over or promised the land of Palestine to the Zionists over the heads of the Palestinian population. I don't want to get sidetracked too much, but Arthur Balfour, after whom it is named, is quite an interesting figure, because at that time he was Foreign Secretary. He was also Prime Minister in the 1900 to 1906 Tory government. And Balfour in 1905 presided over the first Immigration Act, but it was an Immigration Act directed not against Muslims or black people or whoever. It was against Jewish immigrants from Tsarist Russia, who were the victims of pogroms in Russia, because that was where the majority of Jews lived, in something called the Pale of Settlement. Over 2 million of them emigrated, most of them to the United States. That's why there's such a large Jewish community in the United States today. But quite a number of them actually stopped over in Britain and never got any further than Britain, which is why you have a Jewish community in Britain, a large one rather than a very tiny one. Well, Arthur Balfour in 1905, as Tory Prime Minister, he presided over something called the Aliens Act, and it was directed against Jews. It had been the subject of much lobbying by really a proto-fascist group called the British Brothers League, led by William Evans Gordon, who was a Tory MP for Stepney. I know I'm going into quite abstruse detail, but if you ever read the memoirs of Chaim Weizmann, he was the first president of the Israeli state. Well, he was based in Britain. He was also the president of the World Zionist Congress for many years. And if you read his autobiography called Trial and Error, and I do suggest you read it, he says of William Evans Gordon, who was a thorough anti-Semite, didn't like these Jewish immigrants at all. I mean, the same stuff you get today about immigrants from Poland sponging off our state and taking our benefits and using our national health service. It was all said about the Jews of that time. They only came here for, we didn't have a national health service then, but they took our jobs, they undercut our wages, all the same racist tropes that you hear today were said then. And the leader of this was William Evans Gordon. Chaim Weizmann, if you read Trial and Error, and I do suggest that you do, it's quite an interesting book, although it's quite dishonest. And he says about the Jewish reaction at that time, that his fellow Jews were rather hard, and I'm quoting him exactly, I can recall it, were rather hard on William Evans Gordon. After all, he only cared for the British workers. It wasn't he was anti-Semitic. He just didn't see why the ghettos of Warsaw and Polotsk, which was a major city in Poland at the time, should be transferred to London and become the ghettos of Whitechapel. So Weizmann was very sympathetic to the first British anti-Semites. He understood what their concerns were because he actually agreed with them. He didn't want Jews to come to Britain. He'd much prefer that they went to Palestine and settled in Palestine. So Arthur Balfour, as they presided over the first Immigration Act, an anti-Semitic act directed at Jewish immigrants, and the Zionist organisation in Britain at that time, the English Zionist Federation, welcomed it. They were quite happy with it because it meant there was more settlers in Palestine. And indeed, in 1917, when the Lloyd George War Cabinet agreed to the Balfour Declaration, there was one cabinet minister who opposed this act. His name was Sir Edwin Montagu, who later became Secretary of State for India. He was also the only Jewish member of the War Cabinet. And he wrote a memo to all his fellow cabinet members accusing them of anti-Semitism. He said, the reason why you support the Balfour Declaration is you don't want Jews in this country. You want them to go to Palestine. And he attacked them precisely on those grounds. He was a member of the Liberal Party as well. So when they tell you today that it's anti-Semitic to be opposed to Zionism, again, you can point to the past where Jews were fiercely hostile. Now, Haj Amin al-Husseini, to get back to it, was appointed by Viscount Samuel, who was a very pro-Zionist British politician, who later became the first High Commissioner of Palestine, even though he came fourth in the election. It was an election to the post of Mufti. As usual, the practice was you take one of the candidates who come in the top three, but no, the Mufti, Haj Amin al-Husseini, came fourth, but he was nonetheless appointed because he was such a reactionary and pro-British, if you like, politician at that time. So the British and the Zionists were extremely happy with this reactionary Arab, who later became the leader of the Palestinians, who were then a feudal population. They were peasants mainly. They were not organised, and so the reason why the Mufti rose to prominence had nothing to do with the Palestinians. They never elected him. It was a British and a Zionist who singled him out as the leader of the Palestinians. And of course it's true that in the Second World War he'd already sold out. He had very little credibility amongst the Palestinians after the Arab Revolt of 1936 to 39, because the Mufti sold out the Arab struggle then and tried to call it off. But he went to Nazi Germany and he played a quite despicable role. But Netanyahu, you see, had a problem. When he gave a speech to the World Zionist Congress in 2015, he basically said that the Mufti was responsible for the Holocaust. That the only reason why Hitler didn't expel the Jews instead of murdering them was because the Mufti had persuaded them that they would all go to Palestine. It was therefore better to kill them off. Well, he got all his dates wrong. The final solution started 6 months before the Mufti had even met Hitler. And the Mufti didn't know the final solution until about 1943. So he got all his facts wrong, and he based it on testimony by Vizwiseni, who was one of the main Nazi leaders, the Eichmann's Juden commando. But leave that aside. For the Zionists, of course, the real enemy has never been the Nazis, and has never been the anti-Semites. It has always been the Palestinians. And the question today is how you transform the Arabs, the Palestinian opposition to Zionism and to Israel, into the equivalence of what the Nazi opposition was. That is what Netanyahu was trying to do, very clumsily and unsuccessfully at the Zionist Congress. If you don't remember that speech, I suggest you just Google it. It will come up. You could also Google my name and Jacobin, and you'll find out the article which I did for the American blog called Jacobin. It's a major left-wing blog where I go into the background to this story. But I just come back to it again, that Zionism and anti-Semitism, I mean, historically, Zionism was always seen as a form of Jewish anti-Semitism.
I don't think I've got anything to add to that. I think you've said it all.
Okay, do you have any more questions? No? Okay, so I guess we can wrap up there. Just before we leave, I would just like to remind you that at the last Monday of every month, at 7 o'clock, we have our branch meetings of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. It will either be sometimes it will be at this centre or the NUT office, which is on Hucknall Road. You would have signed up to our mailing list if you signed your name on the clipboard, and so it will be emailed out prior to the meeting. So if you would like to get involved, please do, and come along to our meetings. And I believe the next Momentum meeting, if anyone wants to get involved, because we talked about this, is on Tuesday at the Mechanics at 7 o'clock. So thank you very much for coming. Yes, Andy.
Could you just remind people that there's a bucket for donations towards the fire of the room on the table, and also
So detainees box is under that chair, and at the back of the room is for the room. So thank you very much for coming, and another round of applause.
I'm going to go blog for the meeting tonight. Thank you. Right, yes. I might try and